Here I am in my taco hat, student at home. Okay, so let's talk about the historical reading that you did for today. And I had given you three different readings to try to think a little bit about the position of women in the Victorian times. So let's take a look at that first reading, which is the woman question, which is on page 653, if you've got the newest edition of the Norton. And if you happen to have the old edition like me, it's on page 1607, but the new edition is on page 653. So this particular section is talking about traditional gender roles in the Victorian times. And one of the things that it mentions is that Queen Victoria supported women's education. The first women's college in England opened its doors in 1847, which is even earlier than in the United States. There were eventually, in the Victorian era, 12 colleges and universities that opened their doors to women. And it also notes, of course, that Queen Victoria opposed women getting the vote. So that's one of the reasons that women didn't push super hard for the vote during her reign and did not get the vote until after World War I. Another thing that it discusses in this introduction is on page 654, about halfway down, if you look at that long paragraph, talking about how, they thought that there should be a separation of the spheres, ideally, so that, especially for women who didn't have to go out and work, that women should be in the home, very domestic, and that the public sphere was sort of men's sphere. But let's take a look at that description of the ideal Victorian woman, because what I want to try to draw up for you here on the board is the difference between the angel in the house, which is what the ideal Victorian woman was sometimes called. And that name comes from a poem by Coventry Patmore that became very popular. And then on the other side of things is the fallen woman, who we'll be talking about today and also the second half of the week. It says here that the ideal Victorian woman, in that last sentence in the middle of the page, that women were valued for qualities considered especially characteristic of her sex, tenderness of understanding, unworldliness and innocence, domestic affection, and it says, and in various degrees, submissiveness. And to this, I would add a few things. So this is like the good Victorian woman. I would also say she was generally sort of chaste and restricted. And maybe self-sacrificing, I would add that too. She's always thinking of others before herself. But these were the qualities that were most esteemed in a young woman of the time. So again, these domestic qualities, domestic affection, tenderness of understanding, but overall the sense of innocence, the sense of purity, submissiveness, being chaste, restricted, self-restricted, and self-sacrificing. And on the other side of things, there was the fallen woman. How would a woman go from this side to that side? How would the good girl go bad? I guess is another way of saying this. The Victorians referred to this as the woman who had lost her virtue. And that's a very euphemistic statement. been corrupted somehow or seduced. So what does that mean according to these Victorian euphemisms? What kind of woman are we talking about here? What has happened to her? The woman who has lost her virtue. How could a young woman lose her virtue in Victorian society? Some eventually becoming a prostitute, and certainly all prostitutes were seen as fallen women. But I might add that even though some women chose to be prostitutes, there were other women who saw prostitution as no other option because they had become fallen women. And the way those women became fallen is because they were quote-unquote seduced. And by seduced, what the Victorians meant was that they had sexual relations before marriage. By Victorian imagination or Victorian standards, seduction included both women who were in love and tempted to sleep with a man before marriage, but it also included women who had been raped. And they made very little distinction between those things. And it's very troubling to 21st century audience, or 21st century people, I think. But a woman who had slept with a man before marriage was seen as sullied or corrupted. She was seen as having lost her virtue. A woman should never give in to that before marriage. For many of these women, the mark of that she had slept with the man, of course, was that, because sometimes, obviously, you would think, how would people know? She would get pregnant. The Foundling Hospital video that I want you to watch, that's done by the University of London, is very eye-opening. The Foundling Hospital was a place for these fallen women, and that's the term the Victorians used, these fallen women who had been seduced, to go and take their babies once they had had their babies, to give up the babies for adoption. Because the baby was the mark of that quote-unquote shame for the woman. And once she gave up the baby, the idea was that she could go back to her life as it was. So perhaps her family, unfortunately a lot of families would cast out young women who got pregnant, who were seduced, cast them out even into the street. These young women would have no place to live, no place to go. There were homes that were set up for these women to go to, like a shelter. And then these young women could take their babies to these foundling hospitals. You'll see in the video, they have records and records of these women. The women were asked a bunch of questions. The women were always encouraged to say, I was seduced, I made a mistake, I need somebody to take my baby so I can go back to my family, or I can go back to my position that I had before. And the whole idea was that this was kind of a porous border, that hopefully the fallen woman could come back into upstanding society. And that was one way for her to do that, was to give up her baby for adoption. And these are by very strict Victorian moral standards. Unfortunately, a lot of women who ended up in this position, seen as fallen, cast out on the street by their families, did turn to prostitution. So I just want to clarify, all prostitutes were seen as fallen women, but not all fallen women were prostitutes. So I think there's a distinct difference there. But a lot of women who were put in this position had no other option but to become prostitutes. Women who were not taken back by their families, women who had expected marriage from a man and then were left behind. Some of these women had nothing else that they could do, nowhere to go except for prostitution. And we'll talk about prostitution in a minute. But this is just showing you this very, very strict moral standards that the Victorians had. I think there's still remnants of this in our society today. An example might be if there's a young woman who gets pregnant and she goes to a very religious school or something like that. A lot of times those students are quote unquote disappeared. Do you know what I mean? those students don't come back the next semester. Or their family, they might go live with grandparent or something like that. Hopefully the family wouldn't kick them out on the street. But I still think we see some remnants of this in society today. But very, very strict sort of moral standards, definitely, for the time period. The other thing that's talked about in this introduction, and obviously we'll get to prostitution in a minute, but is it talks about in the mid-Victorian era, women wanting more. So women wanting more than just being confined to like the domestic sphere. And you remember that quote that we looked at in Jane Eyre, I think it was day 2, where she says, I don't want to confine myself to, just like other women, I don't want to confine myself to making puddings and knitting stockings and playing on the piano and embroidering bags. Remember that quote? Well, it's here. They put it in. It's on page 655. And I just wanted to show you how objectionable this was for the Victorian society in the 1840s. They give an example of 2 women who read Jane Eyre. This is on page 65, after the quote, 655. Margaret Oliphant called the novel a wild declaration of the rights of woman, and Elizabeth Rigby attacked its, quote, pervading tone of ungodly discontent. So that just shows you how the feminism of Jane Eyre rubbed the audience the wrong way in the 1840s. So asking for too much. But in the next section of reading that I gave you, it talks about the transformation of women's status. So let's take a quick look at that. It's on page 680, or if you have the old book, it's 1634. But I think most of you have the new book. It's on 680. This is written by Walter Besant, who was a historian and a novelist as well. But here he's looking at the transformation of women's status in the Victorian times. And what's really amazing is that because Queen Victoria was on the throne for so long, and we're looking at such a long, like a 60-year plus historical era, the position of women in society at the beginning of the Queen Victoria's reign is very different than at the end. So he compares a young girl born in around 1815 to a young lady born in around 1875. And he was saying their lives would be totally different, especially if they're middle class. So a young woman born around 1815 who grew up in the early Victorian times, she would not have gotten a good education. In fact, she would prefer her ignorance. When she would go to social gatherings, even she would prefer to be childishly ignorant on all subjects, he says, and always defer to a man's opinion. She would be ignorant on art, history, science, literature, politics, and sociology, and expect a man to know much more about those than she. Then he talks about the young woman who would be born in around 1875, coming of age in the 1880s and 90s. He points out that this particular woman would be very educated. As a woman of the middle class he's talking about. She'd be very well educated. She can learn, she can go to the university if she wants to. She can learn about the structure of the body if she wishes. At school and at the university, she can study the same subjects that the young man studies. And she might study harder and with greater concentration. In other words, she has more to overcome than the male classmates. He says, and by the way, I'm on the next page, he says, she has invaded the professions. I like that word, invaded. It's interesting. The only thing that she cannot become is a priest. So she can't enter the clergy. It's still forbidden for women to enter that. But he said that by the end of the Victorian era, women had entered every other profession. So women had become nurses. Women had become doctors. Women had become surgeons. Women were working as journalists. They were writing in all branches of literature. They were working as accountants, architects, actuaries, agents, and practicing law by the end of the Victorian times. And think about how different that was from the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria, where women were in almost no professions at all. The only professions open to a middle-class woman were being a governess or being a teacher, and those were commonly given up after marriage. So this was total transformation of women in society. There is a picture here. My students are really enjoying this picture of the woman on the bicycle. This is the first time that women started to wear pants. And they did that so that they could ride bicycles. And these were called pedal pushers. It's a split skirt. Now, it's obviously very feminine and very frilly and flouncy and all that. But here at the end of the Victorian period, these women were sometimes called new women. And they would have bicycles, and they would just go wherever they wanted, and they would have, jobs that they attended. And sometimes they were satirized as being these kind of like trash-talking, smoking women. You'll see that in the comedic periodicals of the era. But a huge transformation for women during this era. So he even mentions on this last page, in the early Victorian days, a young woman would hardly go out of the house. And if she went out of the house, she would have to have a chaperone. Or if she were with a young man, she would have to have a chaperone. He says that here at the end of the Victorian era, when he's writing this in the 1890s, he says, now the girls just do whatever they want. They go off on their bicycles, and their parents can't keep them in the house. And he says she doesn't need a young man to protect her. She can protect herself perfectly well. So it's just a whole different idea of what a young woman should be or should do at the end of the era versus at the beginning of the era. Responses? I always think, wow, I would have wanted to be born at the end of the era versus the beginning. It sounds awfully constricted. But this is a very eye-opening picture, I think. The other reading that I gave you is from Sarah Ellis from The Woman of England, and this is more about the angel in the house. And so if you look back at page 666, and sorry, I know this is a lot of little bitty readings here, but I think it's 660. No, that's Great Social Evil. I'm sorry, 656. 656. This is an early Victorian commentary by Sarah Stickney Ellis, written in 1839. So that's even before Jane Eyre, where she's talking about women as the moral center of the home. So you can see this is the ideal Victorian mother here, pictured on 657. With her children nestled about her, and the men are over in the corner talking, but the woman is here with her children. And it's such a sweet image. I'm a mother myself, and I know that these moments last for about 5 seconds until your children start, doing bad stuff. But the hug is very sweet, and then they'll be hitting each other or something. But this is the ideal Victorian woman. As depicted in this particular era. And this is called Home Comforts. Sarah Stickney Ellis points out in this section that it should be a woman's duty to be the moral center in the home. She says she, the woman, should be the protector of morals in the home, the minor morals of life, from whence springs all that is elevated in purpose and glorious in action, she says. So in other words, the woman versus the man should be the moral center of the home. She's putting that duty on women. And she says on 658, now notice this again, this is early Victorian age, before women are starting to go to the university. She says that, some people think that education is beneficial to women, but she says, notice that the quality that is loved in women above all else is kindness. And so she's really stressing this, like the domestic affection, this restrictedness, and like the self-sacrificing nature of the Victorian woman, and trying to play that up. And again, note the date, it's 1839. And that goes along very well with what women were expected, what was expected of the Victorian women of that era. Any comments on any of those readings before we look specifically at the fallen woman and the prostitute in more detail? Does anybody see any problems with the strictness of the Victorian society? Like, what kinds of problems does it seem to be setting up? Yeah, there's sort of this imbalance of gender that you see, and there's something that we haven't quite talked about yet, which is the double standard that the Victorians had at the time. So they're saying that the woman should be the moral center of the home. They're not stressing that the man should be the moral center. And I still might see the man as the breadwinner, but he's not the moral center of the home. And in fact, a lot of these societal pressures were placed upon women and not men. And so, for example, just looking at this ideal of the angel in the house, it was expected that a woman would be very chaste and have no sexual knowledge before marriage. But that was not expected of men. It was expected that a man might even have sexual experience before marriage. But how can that be possible? He's not going to find that experience with these women that he's expecting to marry. And he might not get married till he's 30 or 35. Where is he going to go find that experience? And this is my segue, right, into today's readings. He's going to go down to the brothels. And that at the time was seen as just a part of society. That a man might, from time to time go and visit prostitutes. And although society looked down on prostitution, Victorian society looked down on prostitution, they sort of considered that the way of the world. And because of these kind of weird standards that they had and that discrepancy between men and women, it kind of set up prostitution as being such a problem that it was in society. So let's take a look at Great Social Evil. This is on page 666. If you've got the old edition, it's 1620, but I think most of you have the one that's on 666. And I had asked that you write on this for your homework today. Hopefully you all remembered to do your homework. If you forgot to do it, please upload it after class. Let me talk just a little bit more about Victorian prostitution before we look at this text and also the text of Jenny. I think it's especially eye-opening if you consider the early and mid-Victorian era and you think about the question of what was the most profitable job that a woman could hold in the early to mid-Victorian era. And the answer is, the most lucrative job, the answer is being a prostitute. And I think that answer will tell you why there were so many women prostitutes at this time. Because you couldn't make that kind of money working in a factory. You couldn't even make that kind of money working as a teacher. You could only make that kind of money selling your body. And that's why so many women were tempted into doing this as a profession. And of course, some women had very little choice to support themselves. There were three classes of prostitutes, or three kind of varieties of prostitutes during this era. There were women who worked in brothels. Those would be women who would be controlled by a man or woman who owned the brothel. They would have lodging, but they wouldn't have a lot of choice about, clients. A lot of the money that they made would go to the owner of the brothel. Those would be sort of the lowest class of prostitute. There were other women who would solicit on the street and may have work for themselves, and they might have their own apartment. And this is what we see in Jenny, where he met a woman dancing and then he went back to her room. He's not in a brothel. He's just like in a tavern or something like that, and he went back to the woman's apartment, but she's working as a prostitute. So this would be a woman who's able to keep all of the money that she makes, and she works for herself. Then there would be what were called at the time kept women. And these would be women who would serve middle and upper class men, and usually exclusively one man, or at least one man for a period of time. And the man would provide an apartment or a place for the woman to live. The man might be married, he might be unmarried. But in his free time, he would come and visit his mistress, who would live in the apartment that he provided for her. And this was a very, very lucrative position for a woman to be in. Now, she'd still be a fallen woman by Victorian standards, but she would be a kept mistress of a man, a kept woman. And this is very similar to what Rochester talks about with his mistresses. And I'm not exactly sure the difference between a mistress and a high-class prostitute, but at this particular time. But you can see that there would be a very different job working in a brothel versus working on the street versus being a quote-unquote kept woman. Now, during the mid-Victorian period, one problem that they saw with prostitution, one major social problem, was the number of sexually transmitted diseases that were going through the population. And many of these diseases were fatal. So, for example, today, syphilis is not fatal. We have penicillin. You can treat it with penicillin. But they didn't have that in the Victorian times, and it was fatal. And you saw what happened to Bertha Mason after she got syphilis. So they tried to crack down on prostitution largely because of contagious diseases. And there was something passed at the time in the 1860s. Oh, my pen is running out. But they were called the Contagious Diseases Acts. And I'll tell you about the acts, and then I want to know what you think of them. So the Contagious Diseases Acts that were passed in the 1860s were a number of acts that said that any woman suspected of being a prostitute could be arrested and mandatorily checked for STDs. So let me go over that again one more time. Any woman suspected of being a prostitute could then be arrested, legally arrested, and taken into custody and mandatorily checked for STDs. Do you see any problem with this? Yes. What are some of the problems that you see with such legislation? I can think of at least 3 major problems with this.
It's like violating.
It's very violating of like personal bodily self for women. To being dragged off to a police station by a man and having to undergo an exam. They're not talking about a blood test here. They're talking about like go into a room and strip, and we're going to check you for a venereal disease. No, that is a violation of privacy, of bodily privacy. So I think that's one major problem we're seeing here. What about the fact that it says any woman suspected of being a prostitute? Who is that?
Could be anyone.
That could be anybody. So probably, and this is in fact what they did, is they would just go downtown after dark, and anybody on the street was subject to being dragged off by police and taken down to see if they have STDs. But as this writer comments, she says, you say there are 80,000 of us in London? That's a monstrous falsehood, she says. You're lumping in all of the poor women. So, you know, we studied the working conditions in the Victorian era. Some people had to work 10 hours a day to support their families. Of course they're out after dark. Of course they're coming back from the factory after dark. And sometimes they have to stop and get something to eat. Any woman out after dark could be suspected of being a prostitute. And they're going to stereotype. They're going to look at how women are dressed. They're going to look at how women are acting. This is going to make women afraid of police. This is creating a huge social problem. The other problem that I see with it is that it doesn't really seem to be an act that's protecting these women, because there was no cure for these STDs. It wasn't like they were like, now that we see you have an STD, we're going to cure it. No. They were going to just lock the woman up, or, you know, I'm not exactly sure what they were going to do with her if they saw that she had an STD. But it seems like this is trying to protect men. They're not taking men and checking them for STDs. They're not checking the men going into the brothels. They're not checking like the Navy men coming in on ships. They're checking the women. So they're trying to protect the men, I think, and they're trying to protect the women, the wives of those men. But it seems like, again, part of this double standard that they're not checking men at all for this. They're just checking women. So they're putting all the blame on women. These acts were eventually repealed in the 1880s. That was a long time to have those laws on the book. And one of the things that this caused women to do was to actually stand up for their personal rights and their bodily rights, and not just working class women, but middle class and upper class women got involved in this too. And so this led to some very good social reform. But it's just incredible when you think about the kind of like personal violation that these acts would encourage. This particular essay was written in 1858 as that legislation is starting, and before it completely goes fully on the books. But you can see her allude to it at several moments in the essay. Let's talk for just maybe 5 or 10 minutes about this essay, and then we'll turn to Jenny. What was your response to this? And this is an anonymous letter, meaning that we don't know the woman's name, that she wrote to the editor of the London Times, which is a newspaper read by everybody, where she talks about how she grew up, why she became a prostitute, and then looks at the position of the prostitute in society. What's your response to this letter? Let's start with her childhood. What do you make of her childhood? What kind of childhood did she have? Her parents were working class. They did whatever they could to survive. Her dad was a brickmaker. Her mom worked odd jobs. What kind of position does she describe being in as a child because of this? What was the only way she had to sort of rise in the world? Because she could have, I guess, gone into her parents' profession as well. But her mom keeps telling her she should do something because she had such a pretty face. "My face is my fortune, kind sir," was the song that her parents had her sing as a child. And her mother commented about how pretty she too had been when young, and what a fool she had been, and how she might have done better for herself had she been wise. What do you think her mom intended for her to do as such a pretty young child born into poverty? I don't think it's prostitution. I think it's something else. I hope you're not thinking prostitution. I think her mom meant for her to marry well. I think the idea was, you're such a pretty child. You're such a lovely child. Maybe you'll attract a wealthy man, a nice middle class man, who will take you away from this poverty. I think that's really what her mother intends here. Instead, something very different happens. First of all, she talks about the fact that when she's 13 years old, she sort of moves from this side to this side of things. And she says that I had commonly had a strong curiosity and a natural desire. And she says, and then I lost what? Not my virtue, for I never had any virtue. She says that she wasn't taught these values. She wasn't taught the values of the angel in the house. And so when she was curious with a boy, she gave herself to the boy. And she, by society's eyes, ended up on the other side of things. But she stresses, I never lost that which I never had, my virtue. Now, I should stress, and I know it's very disturbing to us as 21st century people, the age of consent in the Victorian times was 13. That was very common in the Victorian era. So this would be very common to the reader of the time, especially readers of particular areas, I would say. But what about the way that she's framing this? She says, I never lost what I never had my virtue. And then she says, and then this young woman came into town and she was dressed so well and she, she had such nice clothes and she promised me a career. And she introduced me to the great world. She commenced my career as what you better classes call a prostitute. She says, I cannot say that I felt any other shame than the bashfulness of a novitiate, like a novice, introduced to strange society. Remarkable for good looks and no less for good temper, I gained money, I dressed gaily, and I soon agreeably astonished my parents and old neighbors by making a descent upon them. I don't know what her mother said, but she came home and she had money and she had clothes. Comments on this? And how might this be eye-opening to the average Victorian reader?
Obviously, it's not seen as like bad and like not a great way to live, but her quality of life is better because she's a prostitute.
Yeah, and that's going to be really eye-opening for the reader. It's the sense of this essay is providing us with a rags to riches story. And I think the Victorian reader is used to that in fiction and elsewhere. It's a very common fairy tale, right? It's the sense of someone is born poor and they find a way to work themselves up until they are comfortable and happy and wealthy. And they're used to this rags to riches story with like the young businessman or something like that, who gets his feet under him and he starts his own business and he's able to make something of himself. But here we have the self-made woman instead of the self-made man. But instead of being the young entrepreneur, which obviously she didn't have the ability to do, she pulled herself up out of poverty by becoming a prostitute. And this is going to shock the Victorian reader, I think. Unless the Victorian reader had thought about this before. But the very fact that she says, I improved myself, I got nice clothes, I got a nice place to live, and not only that, but she got an education. So what happened was she met a young man when she was 18 years old and became like a kept woman. And he wanted to educate her. She says, I commenced the work of my education, and she, got the same accomplishments that she would get that a young lady would traditionally get at this time. And so she made something of herself. She wouldn't have gotten an education as a young poor girl. She wouldn't have gotten any, these nice things. There was no way for her to work herself up to that through a profession at this particular time period. And so now she says, so now I'm a prostitute. What, do you have the right to abuse me? Am I a hideous cancer in society? She says, I've never stolen. I've never murdered anybody. I've never defrauded anybody. I don't offend the public eye. I go all the places that ladies go. I go to the opera. I go to the theater. I go to the well-run casino. And she says, and when I sit at the theater, I sit right next to the patron of the Society for the Suppression of Vice. I sit next to the upstanding lady at the theater, and she has no idea who I am because I'm dressed just like her. So she's like passing as genteel, in other words. What is she pointing out here for her Victorian audience? What is she challenging?
Prostitutes don't deserve the abuse that society is giving them.
Yeah, that's one of the major points here.
She's just as good as, the virtuous woman. She's doing the same thing as the virtuous woman.
Yeah, she says that she's saying, I don't feel like it's right for you to treat me as if I'm a cancerous growth in society or as like a sinful when what I have done is improve myself. So she's really, really challenging the average Victorian reader here and really humanizing the prostitute. So I think that occasionally in our society we see this too. Like, have any of you seen the movie Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts, the classic 80s movie? I love that movie, and that movie does the same thing, where the story is her story, where she goes from being a streetwalker to being a kept woman to being a woman in love with a man who's kind of forbidden because she's a prostitute. But it humanizes the prostitute, and it shows from their perspective what life might be like. What is her argument here about society? What is she saying the problem is? Because she's saying you shouldn't just blame the women. You shouldn't just blame these women you see on the street. This is part of a bigger problem. So what does she point out is part of the problem here? Because she calls prostitutes victims on 669. She says, wouldn't it be more fitting to call many of these women victims of society? So in other words, she's saying, and a woman who considers her an upstanding moral woman might see a prostitute on the street and want nothing to do with her. It was very common at the time for prostitutes to get jeered at and spit upon on the street and things like that. And she's saying, what right have you to treat us like that? And another point she makes is that these women who consider themselves morally upright and consider prostitutes sort of the scum of the earth, they never do anything to bridge the gap between them or to offer them any other opportunities. Let's see. She says that there's at some point in the essay where she says, why don't you bridge that gap? So it's on the top of 669, or 668, 669. Let's see. You railers of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, you the pious, the moral, the respectable, as you call yourselves, who stand on your smooth and pleasant side of the great gulf you have dug and keep between yourselves and the dregs, why don't you bridge it over or fill it up, and by some humane and generous process absorb us into your leavened mass until we become interpenetrated with goodness like yourself? He's being sarcastic there. Why stand on your eminence shouting that we should be ashamed of ourselves? What have we done to be ashamed of? I conduct myself prudently, and I defy you and your policemen too, she says. Why are you standing there mouthing about morality? What is morality? So she's pointing out your moral standards might be different than other people's, and you need to kind of remember that everybody has their own moral standards. And she says, teach us what is right and tutor us in good before you punish us for doing wrong. If we have no other opportunities than prostitution in life, I mean, one of the big things she's pointing out in this essay is that if prostitution is such an attraction for young women, and also something that so many young women are getting kind of pushed into, that this is a societal problem. There needs to be other avenues for women, other ways for women to make money, other ways for women to support themselves, than this system that's set up of prostitution. And as somebody who has chosen that, she doesn't apologize, because look what it's brought her. It's brought her education. It's brought her wealth. It's brought her a position in society she never would have had. Comments on that? Did you sympathize with her when you read the essay? Yeah? Did you only sympathize up to a point, or do you? You didn't feel bad for her?
Like, all power to her.
Yeah. I mean, she's not apologizing for what she's doing. But, sometimes I'll have students that say, well, I sympathized her up to a point, but I feel like now as an adult, she should make different choices. But I think the question becomes, how do you get from here to here? And once you start working as a prostitute, it's even harder. Like, how do you get back here once you've started working as a prostitute? Are there enough choices for women? Are there enough educational possibilities for women? Are there enough societal opportunities for women? And unfortunately, at the time that she's writing the essay, largely the answer is no. It's hard to go back when she's crossed that line. Other thoughts on the essay? I know that you wrote on it in your homework. I see that you're being shy. Other responses to it? If you are interested in the topic of prostitution, this is a really, really great piece to use, I think, because she so effectively, I think, argues for the societal problems that surround prostitution. But also, challenging her reader to see it as just another profession. All right, so let's take a look at Jenny, because I don't want to neglect that. And I have some images to show here, too. Let me pull them up. Oh, it'll be hard to see the images. Well, I'll just pull down. There we go. I'll just get one of the lights. Okay. All of the lights. All right. Let's take a look for just a minute at, see if I can see it on the computer. Here we go. This is Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and he wrote this poem, Jenny, that you read for today. And Dante and Christina are a brother-sister pair. So we've seen, I think the first brother-sister pair we've seen this semester. We've seen a husband and wife pair in the Shelleys. But this is a self-portrait that he did when he was young. And he was very interested in the plight of the fallen woman, and obviously his sister was too, because Goblin Market is very much about the fallen woman. But this is a sketch that he did called The Gate of Memory. And it's very striking. You see a woman here who is a fallen woman, and she's looking through an archway or a gate at some young women and children playing. And what seems to be her emotion here? And notice she's kind of got her arms clutched like this. And this picture is really emphasizing this dichotomy. What does she seem to be feeling here? Notice she's peeking around where they can't see her. What do you feel like what do you think she's thinking or feeling? Little children playing, all innocent. Yeah, I think maybe envy is something that we see here, like a longing or a wistfulness for another time, for when she was a child. For when her life was easygoing and innocent and free. And it's a sense that maybe now she's a streetwalker and she's working on the street and she feels like she's lost that in herself. This was a very common, for those who did sympathize with prostitutes, this was a very common sort of depiction. The sense of the woman who's lost her innocence and regrets that. This is not the woman we see in Great Social Evil. She doesn't regret that. She doesn't regret losing her innocence. This is a job. But I think we see that in this picture, the depiction of the sympathy with the fallen woman who can't go back to her former self and her former innocence. And this is an even more famous image. This is a painting he was working on until the time of his death. It's called Found. And the story that it tells is that a young man was driving into the city to sell a cap at market, and that cap is very symbolic here. This is a pre-Raphaelite artist, so I talked about the pre-Raphaelites the other day with Tennyson, and they were very symbolic in their work. But he has found a woman on the street who he knows. And it's not, of course, clear who she is. It might be his sister, it might be his former neighbor, it might be his former friend, like somebody he used to play with when he was a little boy. And he recognizes her, and she looks like she's fainting. She's totally listless. She's totally pale. I think the colors have changed in the picture, but she almost looks green. And she's pulling her body away from him as if she's fully overcome and fully ashamed that she was recognized. And she's got kind of like the finery on that a streetwalker would have. She's totally ashamed that he's recognized her in this position. So different from her innocent childhood position. So this is in general the kind of sympathy I feel that Dante Gabriel Rossetti had for the prostitute of the time, and he was very much interested in it in his art, and also in this poem that we read for today. And if you're interested in looking at this for your papers, Great Social Evil and Jenny offer different perspectives in that Great Social Evil shows this from the prostitute's perspective, but Jenny shows it from the man's perspective. And that often wasn't considered by Victorian audiences. Usually they put all the blame on women, like this is a women's problem. But that's not true, because it's not going to be, there would be no prostitution if men weren't visiting these women. So one of the things that Dante Gabriel Rossetti is reminding us in this poem is that this is not just a woman's problem. This is a problem that of the men frequenting the prostitutes as well. So let's take a look at Jenny. And this is a difficult poem that we could spend an entire hour talking about, but we obviously don't have that kind of time. It's on page 524. The type of poem this is a dramatic monologue, which means that one person is speaking their mind. And probably one thing that you noticed about it is that it's almost like stream of consciousness. He goes from one thing to the next, shifts back and forth very quickly, and and one thought leads into another. Notice in the poem, Jenny never wakes up. She never gets to give her opinion. She never gets to tell us about who she is. He's guessing things about her, but it's all conjecturable, as he says in the poem. So the situation, of course, is that he met Jenny dancing. He went back to her room, knowing full well that she was a prostitute, and planning to spend the night with her. But she was so tired at the end of the evening, or the end of the night, that she fell asleep. And he's sitting there with her having fallen asleep on his knee, which is a very sweet posture, and not one we would expect being associated with a prostitute. It's almost like a child falling asleep on a parent's knee. And because she looked so sweet and so innocent, he starts to think about, who is this girl and why am I here? And he in moments of the poem, it's very suggested that he's sort of falling in love with her. But it's problematic because she's a prostitute and he can't fall in love with her. But this poem really humanizes the prostitute. She's not just an object of lust. She's a real woman. But it also judges the man as well. It shows the man's judgment because he says things like, oh, she sleeps just like any other woman sleeps. And that shows you how judgmental he was. He never thought of her as a real person. He never thought of her as a person with needs and a history and a story and, a reality. He just thought of her as an object. He talks about the way that other men must use her. He says, maybe you're merely glad that I'm not drunk or ruffianly and let you rest upon my knee. That's around line 65. And he talks about the way people must treat her on the street. They must spit on her. They must yell obscenities at her on the street. And he says, around line 85, other men probably treat you like food, he says. They thrust you aside as when I dine, I serve the dishes and the wine. So she's seen as, like something to, quench the appetite and then thrown away. And there he says, well, handsome Jenny mine, sit up. I filled our glasses, let us sup. And do not let me think of you, lest shame of yours suffice for two. So what he implies there is, hey, Jenny, wake up. I don't like my thoughts. I don't like what I'm thinking. Because if I keep thinking these things, it's making me uncomfortable with being here. So let's get on with it, Jenny. But then Jenny never fully wakes up. Notice what he says there. Lest shame of yours suffice for two. And this is the way that many of the Victorians thought about prostitution. It's the woman's problem. It's the woman's shame. But what about the man visiting the woman? Does not he have no shame? Is he not part of this too? And so it's considering the man's position here. As the poem goes on, what are some things you noticed about the way that he sees her?
He feels bad for her.
Yeah, he feels really bad for her. But then sometimes he teases her and says things like, Jenny, are your lilies dead? And a lily is a flower of purity. So he sees her as dirty and sullied and like a gutter person, but like person in the gutter. But at the same time, he feels sorry for her and sympathizes with her and thinks she's beautiful. So he keeps going back and forth in the poem and how he sees her. There's a section on Cousin Nell, and that's around line 185. And just before that, just as another woman sleeps. How about that? But he compares her to Cousin Nell, and Cousin Nell is kind of like on this side of things. She's the good girl, but he says she's fond of fun and dress and praise just like Jenny. But somehow, even though they're made of the same lump of clay, Jenny's on this side of things. So how did she get to be fallen? It's a fallen woman. He says, one so pure and one so fallen. That's line 207. And he's confused by that. How is it that some women are on one side and some women are the other? By the end of the poem, and I'm sorry, I'm going through it quickly just because we're out of time, but he says, and must I mock you to the last, ashamed of my own shame? And we get the sense that finally at the end of the poem, he feels ashamed. He feels like he's contributing to this problem. And he says, well, of such thoughts so much I know, in my life as in hers they show. By a far gleam which I may near, a dark path I can strive to clear. Only one kiss, goodbye, my dear. And you remember in Pretty Woman when she says we can't kiss because that's like that's a token of affection. And you see that he's falling in love with her. Here he says, I want to clear my own path. I want to clear my own dark path. I want to be a more morally upright person. So I'm going to leave without sleeping with her. But he leaves behind money for her anyway, which seems to be a gesture of kindness or a gesture of pity. But notice at the end of the poem, he makes no effort to save her. He's only going to save himself. So at least some of my students on Tuesday were seeing him as, only kind of serving himself, kind of self-serving here. And one of them, I think one student called him a pompous jerk or something at the end of the poem, the way they saw it, because he's figuring himself as Zeus, the king of the gods, leaving behind gold, a shower of gold for the young maiden. But the poem is a really interesting reflection on the role of the man in prostitution, showing that it's not just the woman, it's the man as well. And that perhaps in understanding the plight of the prostitute or in humanizing her, the man can come to consider his own position. And I think that's really important for considering the moral standards of the era. Any last thoughts? We are out of time. I'm sorry. All right, so if you have any questions about the papers, please send them to me over the next couple of days, ideally. I can also take questions over break, or if you want to send me an outline. Good luck with your papers, and I'll be in touch after break.